Hello, I hope you're there. I'm in my garden. Can you see there's a hedge behind me? Just behind that is the school playground. It's quiet here, enough to know that it's getting a bit dull. It's been a fortnight now. The school playground has been taken over by a herd of deer, and there's a whole load of pheasants running riot in the garden. Apart from that, one thing that isn't at all dull at the moment is the moon. Try and go out and look for it tonight. It's going to be a supermoon. A supermoon, 5,000 times bigger in the sky than a superstar. It'll be huge. It'll light the world up. You don't want to miss that for anything. The last time I was on here, I told the story of the man who'd been born blind. Do you remember? Jesus healed a blind man, and the blind man was very happy about it, but no one else was. People couldn't stand Jesus going around doing miracles. They were jealous, and they thought it would bring the Romans down on them like a ton of bricks. Well, Jesus was on the way to Jerusalem with his disciples, so he'd moved away from the place with the blind man and the haters. But it was a bit out of the frying pan into the fire, because this is what happened next. You remember the story about Mary and Martha in the kitchen and how Mary got in trouble. Well, they had a brother. He wasn't in the earlier story, but yes, they had a brother. And this is a story from the Bible about their brother, Lazarus. There was a man called Lazarus who'd been sick for a very long time. His sisters, Mary and Martha, were so worried that they sent for Jesus in the hope that he might be able to heal Lazarus. Jesus got their message, and he said to the disciples, "Let's go back to Mary and Martha's house and see what we can do for Lazarus." The disciples were happy. They always were happy to do what Jesus wanted, but they were still a bit worried. They'd had a very bad reception last time Jesus had cured someone. When Jesus had healed the man who'd been blind from birth, they were really afraid that he'd be attacked, possibly even killed. But after they'd all talked about it for some time and still not really worked out what to do, one of Jesus' disciples, called Thomas, stood up and said, "We don't know what will happen, but it's time to be brave. Let's go with him. We may as well die with him if necessary." "Right," they said. "One for all for one. We'll do that." So up they got and off they went. When they got to Lazarus' house, they found that he'd already died. They'd had the funeral, and he'd been buried for 4 days. Martha and Mary, of course, were terribly upset, and they said they'd wished that Jesus had come a bit earlier because they thought really he could have done something for them. But Jesus said, "Don't worry, I can do something even now." Martha said, "Don't make promises you can't keep. He's been in the ground too long. He'll be in a terrible state." But Jesus says, "I'm going to give it a go. It's important to do what you can for your friends. Trust me." So they all trooped off to the tomb. When they got there, somebody had rolled the stone away. It was dark inside and it didn't smell very good. And they all stood there and peered in to see what was left of Lazarus. Jesus went and stood right at the entrance to the tomb. He was overwhelmed by compassion for the sadness of his friends, and he'd been crying because he was so upset. Things weren't looking too hopeful. At last he pulled himself together and he stood there and shouted as loud as he could, "Lazarus, come out!" And suddenly everybody gasped and clutched each other in amazement and terror, because there was a creaking and a sighing and a movement, and suddenly there was Lazarus coming out of the tomb, all wrapped up in his white grave clothes. "Help, what do we do now?" everybody said. But Jesus just replied, "It's easy. All you need to do is untie him. Just untie him and let him go." So they managed to pull Lazarus out of the sheets that had been wrapped around him, and lo and behold, he was back to normal, completely healed, laughing and jumping around. He was so happy to be alive again. Martha and Mary, of course, were amazed by what had happened, and they couldn't thank Jesus enough. But the authorities, well, they weren't at all happy. If this Jesus goes on doing this kind of thing, they said, everyone's going to start believing in him. And then where will we be? The Romans will come and take the village over, and we'll lose everything we've got. But the high priest had been stroking his long beard and looking thoughtful. No, he said, this could actually work out quite well. So many people are getting so excited about what Jesus is doing, there could be a riot. And if we get a riot, then we can persuade the Romans that Jesus is dangerous, then they'll arrest him, and they'll do the work for us. Simple. It's better for one man to be punished than everyone else having to suffer. So they decided to put this plan into action. And they all agreed, yes, it's better for one man to be punished than everyone else having to suffer. I'm going to say a prayer now. If you'd like to make it your own, join in saying Amen at the end. Dear God, there are so many people needing help at the moment. We want to do what we can, but it's difficult to know where we can be useful. Help us to show compassion, to look after each other in need, and to watch over our friends. May we learn from your own Son how to be worthy of the trust of others forever and ever. Amen. Enjoy the sunshine. Even more, try and enjoy the moon. Keep well, stay safe, and may God be with you.